Centuries from now, the Cybermen infiltrated space station Nerva, leaving its surviving human crew to ponder hopelessly over which moment would be their last. The Cybermen's goal was born of revenge, to strike at the heart of the planet that had assured victory for the human race during the Great Cyber Wars. Voga, the planet of gold. Whilst using an uncharacteristic amount of literary prose and occasionally posing like a bossy PE teacher, the cyber leader carried out his objective, unaware that his seemingly perfect strategy would derail in the face of an all too familiar time traveller and two of his many companions. The Cybermen forced the surviving Nerva Beacon crew and the Doctor himself into a suicidal quest to detonate the very heart of Voga, and when that failed, they sent the beacon itself spiralling towards the planet. A magnificent spectacle was promised, but with the help of his new human allies, the Doctor thwarted this plan, and this particular breed of Cybermen achieved only their own demise. On this day, Voga and its population triumphed. The planet of gold remained the embodiment of organic life, standing victorious over its would-be cybernetic oppressors. And... whoa. Where did it go? Hello? Voga? Actually, what am I even talking about? What the dickens is Voga anyway? Oh, I see. I must have slipped into an alternate timeline. Not to be mistaken, of course, with a parallel universe before all you Cybus Network and RSF fanatics pipe up. What I'm talking about here is less of two separate realities running concurrently with one another, and more of a sort of what-if scenario. For today, distinguished followers, I'm babbling on about the Cybermen story that never was but could have been. In 1975, Doctor Who viewers were presented with this, but it was almost this. Sort of. I briefly talked about this in my Revenge of the Cybermen review, but for anybody who hasn't seen that video, here's a recap. Revenge of the Cybermen first came to life as a story written by Gerry Davis, who, alongside Kit Pedler, was the original creator of the Cybermen. As the Tom Baker era began and Series 12 of Classic Who was in full swing, it was agreed by all parties that a new Cybermen adventure, the first since 1968's The Invasion, was on the cards. Due to the planned repurposing of the space station set used for Ark in Space, Gerry Davis was tasked with writing a script set on a space station and centred around a limited quantity of Cybermen, and that's exactly what he did. However, producer at the time Philip Hincliffe, whilst liking the premise in principle, deemed Gerry's script a little too aimed at children and hadn't been developed enough or with enough subplots. The final version of the story, which made transmission in 1975, was a version remoulded by script editor Robert Holmes and was largely dissimilar to Gerry Davis's original pitch. In turn, Gerry disliked this new version of what was originally titled Return of the Cybermen, stating in the Cybermen book that he wasn't too pleased with the extensive reworking of what was originally a tautly written suspense thriller. He did, however, recognise its merits in the long term. And so, Revenge of the Cybermen lived on as the one and only Cybermen story of the Tom Baker era, an iconic and somewhat infamous adventure that, whether you like it or not, is an essential piece of Doctor Who's history. As for that original script, well, as it turned out, time refused to let it go. It kind of hovered in the void, with a mildly differing version of it appearing in a 1992 edition of the Dreamwatch Bulletin fanzine. Now that is a cool cover. Never seen one of them before. But it wasn't until fairly recently that this proto-Revenge of the Cybermen story got a true lease of life. Or to be more specific, the Big Finish treatment. You see, Since 2009, Big Finish had been reworking old scripts and story treatments from the classic TV era, in the form of their Doctor Who The Lost Stories range. The range finished up in 2013 but then returned in 2019. It consists of classic TV stories which were either never used, or original versions of stories that did make the cut but were notably different to their original drafts. Only fitting then that they would eventually get round to this one. In 2021, audiences were treated to a full cast, fully fleshed out rendition of that long lost blueprint, The Return of the Cybermen, written by Jerry Davis and adapted by voice actor and Big Finish writer John Dorney, who had access to the original script and even the revised Dreamwatch version, and this eager chimp just had to get himself a copy. Heavily involved in this project is your main Cyberman, Nicholas Briggs, naturally, who co-produced, directed, starred in, scored music and sound for, and script edited this story. Briggs to the max. Particularly striking in this project is his sound work, a lot of bleeps and blips reminiscent of the TV original, and listeners can enjoy the full music score at the end of this audio. It's a hearty mix of that vintage Big Finish Cybermen bombastic brass, peppered with extra spaciness. I played it when I was painting the skirting board on my staircase and it really livened the experience. Return of the Cybermen stars, as one would jolly well hope, the one and only Tom Baker, donning his proverbial scarf for the role of the Fourth Doctor once again. There is also a strongly poignant undertone to this entire production, as both Ian Marter, who played Harry Sullivan, and Elizabeth Sladen, who played Sarah Jane Smith, are sadly no longer with us. The role of Harry was taken on by Christopher Naylor, as was the case in several other Big Finish titles, and Sarah Jane Smith was played by none other than her own daughter, Sadie Miller. I've gathered the general impression, and this was kind of confirmed by some of Briggs's words in the making of feature at the end of this release, that the idea of recreating personas of well-known Doctor Who characters is less about tricking the listener into thinking it's the original performer and more about capturing the essence of that character. Like the last Big Finish Cybermen story I covered for this channel, the ISOS Network, I consider it to be done here to marvellous effect, and being aware that this was no doubt a heart-rending gathering for all the personnel involved makes these performances that little bit more earnest and personal. The idea with Return of the Cybermen is that you can superimpose it onto the timeline of Doctor Who Series 12, in place of Revenge, and have it fit there nice and snug with no lapse in continuity, following on from Genesis of the Daleks and leading on to Terror of the Zygons. The 4 episodes within that time frame are, however, a whole different kettle of silverfish, the most obvious and notable being these guys. Vogans? No, there aren't. Voga? No, it isn't.
In 1974, you couldn't move down here for Cybermen.
Yes, you could. On the cards was a proposed ending that didn't make it into the final product, where John Dorney could explain a way for each version to be equally plausible as one another, and that whole bit of trivia is available to read on Wiki Fandom, and it's dead confusing, so we'll move on. What we do get is something sort of similar to Voga, in that there is an asteroid laden with gold, but this asteroid is inhabited by a community of lost colonists, and more on them as the story progresses. Not only do we get a deeper insight into how a more faithful Jerry Davis adaptation would play out, but we also now get to play the game of what bits are different and which version of the story works best overall. And I'm going to try and help you fellow apes figure that out with some subjective simian takes of my very own. Some positive, some negative. If nerdiness is your flavour, then this is gonna be filthy. If nerdiness is your flavour, then this is gonna be pure filth. Strap in. For starters, there's no pictures or video for you to look at with your eyes because it's audio. Revenge of the Cybermen did have that because it was on the telly. So, as has been the consistent premise since the story's origins, the bulk of the adventure is set aboard the Nerva Beacon, previously visited by the Doctor, Harry and Sarah Jane in the Ark in Space, which also has its own Lost Stories alternative simply titled The Ark, as does Genesis of the Daleks. I just want to keep this video simple for once. The openings to both Revenge and Return are similar, with our party of 3 landing on the beacon via the time ring, except in the audio they land stand in the mess hall, with the listeners already getting a rundown of the trials and tribulations of the Nerva crew, told largely through the perspective of Anitra, a new female addition to the character roster. Warner, on the other hand, can't catch a break. Once again, he is bitten by a cybermat and condemned to a life of death. Poor Warner. After chowing down on the first meal they find, dangerous, the Doctor and co try to make contact with the beacon's occupants, not realising that the crew is also monitoring them. Soon after, Sarah Jane spies her first cybermat, but not this type of cybermat as seen on TV. They are described as and sound distinctly like the old school cybermats, the ones which look like this with the bigger glowing eyes as seen in Tomb of the Cybermen and The Wheel in Space.
Okay, great bit of detective work. I tell myself after I've rendered this video, or I could just look at the cover and observe these guys. Yeah, I think we have a brand new Cybermat model, folks. It's cool, isn't it?
The opening to this audio definitely has more of a pulse. It's a Big Finish story solely driven by dialogue, as opposed to some that have a narrator filling in the gaps, so it needs to be off to the races with a little more efficiency. Within the first act, Kelman, yep, he's here alright, tries to kill our three heroes in a giant crusher, which is a darn sight more exciting than the Doctor getting his arm trapped in a door. So yeah, it does a good job of pulling us in with no room for boredom.
I don't think that axe is going to hold out much longer.
Seems you were right, Olga.
Never miss the obvious, do you, Harry?
Perhaps if I use all my strength, Doctor, try and wedge it myself.
No, don't try your crack like that axe. Only one hope now. Listen to me, whoever you are.
Likewise, it was more important to make the crew more interesting than their TV counterparts. Kelman always had a bit of meat on his bones, but the other two, Lister and Commander Stevenson, were heroic but not very engaging as characters. Look at him there. And so we get these new and improved rough and ready versions, particularly in the case of Commander Stevenson, who has a great deal more swagger in his personality. As I previously mentioned, they are also joined by Anitra, a brand new character who adds a bit of extra backbone to Team Nerva, especially in the latter episodes. In this Big Finish, guys, we have a foundation to the story that feels a little bit more alive. Parallel. It's not long before we get to all the plague talk between the crew and the Doctor and his companions. Warner, being Warner, ends up on his deathbed with lines on his face. Once again, the Nerva crew are quarantined, with Stevenson explaining that their mission serves as a warning beacon for anybody approaching the asteroid belt, which is a nice bit of clarification we didn't get in Revenge. And then Sarah gets bitten, rendering her out the count for the duration. Also similar is that the Doctor clocks the cybermat as the source of the plague, not a plague. Difference. There ain't no teleporting the virus out of Sarah Jane Smith this time around. They need to locate an antidote, plain and simple. Strangely enough, rather than saying, "Oh look, that's a cybermat," the Doctor needs to refer to a drawing of it in his 500-year-old diary, which he also has in Power of the Daleks. It's there that he finds a date and the letters C and T. C is obvious enough, and as clarified on Wiki Fandom, we are supposedly encouraged to assume that the T stands for Telos. The date itself corresponds with the events of Tomb of the Cybermen, which is marked as 2248 AD. That's several centuries out by my reckoning, and also the whole plot point is an extremely bizarre way to bring the Doctor round to the conclusion that this is the work of Cybermen, when he could have just looked at that cybermet and remembered what it was, like he did in Tomb of the Cybermen, even though the audiences never actually saw one before. Nor does any of this have any real bearing on the rest of the story, but here we are. There's lots of gold dust lying around on Nerva. After trying to throw a load of other liquids onto the cybermat, they realise that this is the only thing that actually stops it. The Doctor explains how it's a non-corrodable metal that will plate the interior of their gills. As for the Cybermen themselves, there's no ship to dock in this story. As is the grand tradition of Cybermen being dead creepy, it turns out that they were on the beacon the entire time, hiding, and one of them is in the room with them. End of part 1. But not before we hear this brand of Cybes talk for the very first time.
Those boots, silver, and yet the suits are white.
What?
Stay where you are.
Well, that's a bit more like it, isn't it? For those humble viewers not in the know, one of the main points of contention for Revenge of the Cybermen was the voice acting, namely the cyber leader played by Christopher Robbie, who during this role displayed a certain, shall we say, transatlantic exuberance.
Excellent, Kelman. You have done well. There will be no gold. Voga is to be utterly destroyed.
Obviously they remedied this, with the tried and tested Nick Briggs Cybermen vocals used across virtually all Big Finish Cybermen stories. There's no way that was going to make the jump. However, by the end of the second episode, after Kelman is revealed as traitor and inside man as you knew he would be, the cyber leader makes his entrance, and while it is the cyber leader many of us wish we had in the TV adaptation, to say that he is completely devoid of human expression isn't entirely true.
You should have learned by now. Resistance is useless.
There is still that small level of expression and cadence to his voice, significantly more palatable than the magnificent spectacles of 1975. It's subtle, but it's there.
The asteroid will be struck out of orbit. It will spin off over and over until it burns up in the sun.
Perhaps Nicholas Briggs's homage to Revenge, which he categorically adores. It's a little more humanity and stash twirling than we would typically get from a Big Finish Cyberman, yet it's not unenjoyable. It kind of fits in the mood of the piece if anything, and having insisted that Cybermen were going to have personalities in TV's Revenge of the Cybermen, which was then a trait carried across the rest of classic Doctor Who, the production crew at the time would have been better off doing it this way. The chimp approves. In the run-up to the first appearance of the Cyber Leader, the Doctor and Harry temporarily evade the clutches of the silver block-headed henchman and do some snooping around the beacon. It's there that they find some wounded Cybermen stored in boxes and also the body of a mysterious person, and possibly not a native of planet Earth. So it's revealed that the Cybermen allegedly died out 50 years ago, which is specific, but there's no mention of the Great Cyber Wars. They've ditched that backstory completely, which is funny because, parallel, their plan is virtually identical to the one in Revenge. There is a nearby unnamed asteroid which is singularly the largest resource of gold in the galaxy. It's also wet and cavish sounding. Therefore, it is very much in the interests of the cyber race to destroy it, and they plan on doing so by crashing the Nerva beacon straight into it. Unfortunately, this is where I find the narrative a little lax in comparison to Revenge. As I said, there's no Voga, only this barren rock which isn't actually barren because there are inhabitants on there that we learn about in episode 3. Like the asteroid itself, these guys have no official title, referred to briefly by the Doctor as the Colony of Forgotten Men. I gotta say, I regard Revenge as having the superior context for these components, as Voga and its people had a definitive backstory and one which was intertwined with the Cybermen. Now it's just some random rock that happens to be full of gold and occupied by some people who came seemingly from somewhere. In the case of Return, it's never explained how the enemies of the Cybermen came to exploit the asteroid's gold and weaponize it against them, leaving us to wonder why the Cybermen are so concerned with obliterating this rock in the first place. Some sort of history would be nice, but no such thing is available here. And also, surely the Cybermen would have a better plan to destroy this asteroid than crashing a satellite into it, a missile or a bomb or something. Despite the apparent absurdity of this premise, I do think it's cool that the Cybermen are willing to give up their lives for a suicide mission that benefits the wider species of Cybermen. The cold, calculated logic is impeccable from that standpoint, but strapping bombs to humans and then cattle prodding them to the heart of the rock is much more characteristic of a Doctor Who villain. All that happens here is the humans are ordered to help them crash the beacon. Crashing the beacon was plan B in Revenge and a no-brainer because they had their ship to escape to, and this in turn leads to another hole in this narrative. Like I said, the fact that they are aboard and among the crew is a suitably creepy aspect, but unless I missed something, it isn't explained how they came here, and whether or not they could go back should they have the chance. As for the colony of forgotten men and women, their backstory is that they found refuge in the asteroid after their god supposedly brought the Cybermen down upon them. Now they are forced to live off eating slugs and other scraps. Ironic as the cutlery they eat it with is made of solid gold.
One for you, yes. One for me. What? You got
twice as much as me.
No, it just looks like that because your piece tapers.
You're a liar! A blind man could see is not equal!
Seeing as it's me that found it, you're lucky to get even a piece of the tail.
What about that one I found last week? I was very generous with your portion.
You don't want it, you can eat my axe instead.
Why, you all right? That's fighting words! I've had more than enough of you!
Stop! Stop! Do you hear me? Or I'll crack your foolish skulls open. Are we animals?
They seem to serve as a plot device to aid the Doctor in the latter acts of the story, and to provide a bit of extra grit, with the brains of the bunch Cotsey doing most of the talking before she dies a mildly cheesy death.
Promise me one thing. Before him, before our God, make sure my men are taken aboard Never.
I promise.
Thank you.
Close her eyes.
Might be a cheddar connection there. So they are a rough and ready replacement for the Vogons, and they also enjoy a bit of chess. Though I don't prefer them to Vogons per se, they do sound and feel more like a modern Doctor Who supporting cast, whereas the dramatic politics of Voga may seem a little overcooked for a Cyberman story. I do kind of miss Vorus though, the mad pleb. Speaking of mad plebs, Cybermen aside, Kelman remains the biggest antagonistic driving force in Return of the Cybermen. Yes, he's working with the Cybermen to wipe out the crew of the Nerva Beacon, and yes, he's also playing off both sides so that he can loot all the gold with mutually assured destruction covering his likely shiny arse. That's the parallel. The difference though is that in this account his snivelling treachery is a little more pronounced, with him feeding the lost colonists a whole load of BS about Nerva being an unsafe place riddled with plague, but also bringing this starving community food in exchange for gold. The longer he keeps them stranded here, the richer he gets. It's interesting because in Revenge it's not so heavily implied that he's just after gold. He does seem to sort of want to help the Vogons, and there's that little redemption moment when he sacrifices himself to save Harry. Well, not in this one. After Cotsey learns that her son was murdered aboard the Beacon, the colonists turn on Kelman and he does a runner, before getting blown up in a tunnel. Not much redemption happening this time around, which I think is a kind of shame, but storytelling wise it does make more sense. Soon enough the Doctor is back aboard the Beacon, and with the added objective of making it a refuge for the colonists should the Cybermen be defeated. By now the plan to crash it is well underway, with Stevenson and Lester being forced to plot the course. However, shenanigans are underway, with Anitra helping Sarah and Harry to rig a gold-filled Cybermat as per, parallel, what they did in Revenge.
Nice and tight. Getting the gold dust in the virus reservoir isn't the easiest thing in the world. Done.
Won't it affect the little monster?
Not inside the container. At least not until it's done its job. Then it might be better if it was affected, if you see what I mean.
Ah, cool, I get it now. This results in a magnificent gaggle of audio cybernetic anguish.
A Cyberman! Why?
And the final episode is simply a no-nonsense battle to defeat the Cybermen and stop the Beacon from crashing. When our heroes and their friends start scuffing the Silver Nasty's plans, the Cyber leader states that they will all be destroyed due to all the treachery. But it is instead he who is destroyed. Difference. No blowing up in his own spaceship this time around. That's the easy way out. In this version, he gets shot and bitten by a Cybermat, both at the same time. A far worthier demise of a Cyber leader, I'm sure you will agree. With the Cybermen defeated and with the help of Lister...
Oh yeah, I just realised he doesn't die, does he? Difference.
And Commander Stevenson, the Doctor is able to avoid collision by firing off the retros and bouncing off the atmosphere at the last moment. I like to think the moments before that look like they did in Revenge, with this slowly rotating log thing. And with the added premise of using the now safe beacon to rescue the stranded lost colonists, all is well in another story of vanquished Cybermen, with the timeline neatly snapping back into the precursor to Terror of the Zygons. Difference: Commander Stevenson confesses that he thought the TARDIS was a toilet. So what exactly are Sarah Jane Smith, Harry Sullivan and the Doctor remembering here? Or, to be more precise, What do you like to think they are remembering? Is it their misadventures with Vorus on the planet Voga, or is it their companionship with the quick-witted Anitra as she helped them bring death upon their Cybermen captors? Return of the Cybermen is an interesting offering of what could have been, and I think that's its purpose rather than to necessarily replace its TV counterpart. And the fact that it doesn't continuously hop from inhabited rock to space station, with the characters bouncing from one to the next whilst the Cybermen are forced to continuously change the method by which they destroy their opponents, means that the narrative is more focused. I enjoyed Return of the Cybermen. It's a fun and energetic production, and I think its biggest strength is the wonderful and almost bittersweet way that it pays homage to the characters played by Elizabeth Sladen and Ian Marter, bringing them to life for a brand new audience. I'd even go as far as to say that through its snappy dialogue and authentic characterization, that it amply captures the essence of the early Tom Baker era, a delightful treat for fans. Now, do I think it's a significant improvement on 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen? Well, not really. Subjective Simeon incoming. At the heart of the many rewrites that brought Jerry Davis's original story all the way to this, and then much later down the line this, there is an example of a writer creating a story that, as far as the producers and script editors were concerned, needed improvement. Whether or not their vision of what made a good story was superior to that of Jerry's is a highly debatable topic, but they certainly took a more academic approach to making Return of the Cybermen more TV-worthy, and this was based on the lengthy track experience that Philip Hincliffe and Robert Holmes had when they were working specifically on Doctor Who in the early 70s. Even in the revised format represented by Big Finish, there is that little sense of this story having a basic narrative that needed a bit more fleshing out. I believe that in principle Revenge of the Cybermen serves this purpose, with Voga and its backstory adding extra meat on the bones in a way that the Lost Colonists didn't have the intrigue to manage, and the plan of the Cybermen having to destroy this world having extra plausibility because they don't just want to crash the beacon straight into it, but perform a tactical demolition of it. In terms of execution, well, now that's a different story. The endless back and forth, the ropey special effects, you know. Keep in mind, however, that the majority of this was down to budget restrictions and the general task of writing and producing credible sci-fi entertainment for television to a schedule, and this was always an issue regardless of the story. So when it all boils down, there really is no right or wrong here, and like I said, I don't think this is offered up as a replacement for Revenge of the Cybermen. Revenge is the more universally known and accepted version, and has therefore garnered an unquantifiable amount of affection in the last 40 years. And as we all know, that personal relationship between audience and media is sacrosanct. What we really want is a sort of ultimate version which combines the two, one where sensibly voiced Cybermen rage war with Voga, where the Nerva Beacon crew are rough and ready, with Anitra helping to turn Cybermen weaponry on Cybermen, where Vorus and the Lost Colonists have a rocket each to launch into space, thus doubling the jeopardy, where the Doctor gets his arm stuck in a door and the TARDIS gets used as a toilet and... Okay, I'll stop. But most importantly, one where the cyber wars are acknowledged. Because isn't that the big catalyst that changes everything? It's time I investigated. If you liked this video, then it would be an honour and a privilege to see you over on my Patreon page at patreon.com/chosenchimp. For just £1 a month, you can become a distinguished follower and request your Doctor Who topic for coverage. I love talking about the classics, in case you hadn't already noticed, but really any Doctor Who related stuff you want me to talk about, just hit me up and I'll think it over. Your contribution goes towards making this channel a bigger, smarter, stronger place, so your support will be greatly appreciated. Hope things are well with you all. Till next time, have a good one.